Apple's market value soared by more than $3.6 trillion dollars under a man who was repeatedly told he lacked the visionary genius of his predecessor. And now, after 15 years, Tim Cook is officially stepping down as CEO. According to a formal announcement from Apple on April 20th, 2026, Cook will transition to the role of executive chairman on September 1st, handing the reins to John Ternus, the company's senior vice president of hardware engineering. The timing is deliberate, ensuring the highly anticipated September product event will be fully under Ternus's direction. We are witnessing the end of an era that fundamentally reshaped consumer technology and global supply chains. Julian, when Steve Jobs handed over the company in 2011, the skepticism was palpable. People thought Cook was just an operations guy who could never keep the magic alive. Yet, he is leaving behind a $4 trillion juggernaut.
The skepticism was entirely based on a misunderstanding of what Apple needed at that specific moment in its history. Steve Jobs was the product visionary who gave the world the iMac, the iPod, and the iPhone. He created the cultural phenomenon. When Cook took over, the challenge was no longer about inventing a new category every 3 years. The challenge was scale. Cook, who originally joined Apple in 1998 to overhaul its worldwide sales and operations, recognized that the smartphone revolution required a logistical mastermind. He transformed Apple into a machine capable of sourcing materials, manufacturing millions of devices flawlessly, and shipping them globally without delay. As Dipanjan Chatterjee, a principal analyst for Forrester, recently pointed out to the press, Cook took Jobs' legacy and built a durable, resilient financial powerhouse. He proved that operational stewardship can be just as valuable as raw product innovation.
Operational stewardship sounds significantly less romantic than inventing the future in a garage. Critics argue that under Cook, Apple became overly reliant on incremental updates. We see a new iPhone every year with slightly better cameras and marginally faster processors, but the groundbreaking, industry-shaking announcements became rare. The Apple Watch and AirPods were massive commercial successes, but they are ultimately accessories to the iPhone. Even the pivot to services, pushing Apple Music, Apple TV, and Apple Pay, felt like a monetization strategy rather than a technological breakthrough. Does Cook's legacy suffer because he focused on squeezing every possible dime out of the existing ecosystem rather than creating the next paradigm-shifting device?
We have to separate the romanticized mythology of Silicon Valley from the reality of running the world's most profitable publicly traded company. The transition to services was actually a brilliant strategic maneuver. Hardware sales naturally plateau as markets saturate. Cook recognized that the hundreds of millions of active Apple devices represented an unprecedented distribution network. By introducing Apple Pay, App Store subscriptions, and iCloud storage, he created recurring revenue streams that stabilized the company's income and locked users deeper into the ecosystem. Forbes recently highlighted this exact pivot, noting that Cook's focus on services proved highly successful in insulating Apple from the cyclical nature of hardware upgrades. It was a completely different type of innovation. It was financial and ecosystem innovation. He exported the smartphone revolution from the United States to the rest of the world, making the iPhone the default computing device for an entire generation.
That brings us to the man inheriting this $4 trillion ecosystem. John Ternus is not a household name, even for people who follow technology closely. He has been at Apple since 2001, joining the product design team shortly after graduating from the University of Pennsylvania with a degree in mechanical engineering. By 2013, he was vice president of hardware engineering, and he has been the senior vice president since 2021. He oversaw the development of the iPad, AirPods, and led the massive transition of the Mac lineup to Apple's custom silicon chips. Apple's statement emphasized that he has the mind of an engineer and the soul of an innovator. However, picking a pure hardware engineer to lead the company in 2026 when the entire industry is pivoting violently toward artificial intelligence seems like a counterintuitive choice.
It seems counterintuitive only if you assume software and AI can exist in a vacuum. Turnus's background as a mechanical engineer actually positions him perfectly for Apple's specific approach to technology. Throughout his 25-year tenure, Ternus has been instrumental in integrating software, silicon, and hardware. The Mac transition to Apple-designed M-series chips is a prime example. That was not just a hardware upgrade, It was a fundamental redesign of how the computer processes tasks, dramatically improving battery life and performance. In the context of artificial intelligence, Apple has consistently preferred on device processing over cloud based computing for privacy reasons. To execute advanced generative AI directly on a smartphone or a laptop, you need incredibly efficient thermal management, highly optimized neural engines in the silicon, and tight integration with the physical components. A hardware focused leader understands those physical constraints better than a purely software driven executive.
Privacy has been a cornerstone of Cook's tenure, often used as a marketing tool to differentiate Apple from companies like Google and Meta. But this hardware-first, on-device processing approach to AI is exactly what critics say is holding Apple back. Reports from outlets like CNET and the Los Angeles Times indicate that Ternus is taking over at a remarkably difficult time. Apple is widely perceived to be lagging behind competitors in the generative AI race, while other tech giants are releasing rapid-fire AI features and securing massive enterprise partnerships. Apple's approach has been described as lackluster and cautious. The question is whether Ternus has the mandate or the instinct to aggressively shift Apple's posture, or if he will succumb to what analysts call the temptation of incrementalism.
The temptation of incrementalism is the biggest risk Turnus faces. When you are managing a product line that generates hundreds of billions of dollars, changing the formula is terrifying. Every minor alteration to the iPhone interface or manufacturing process carries massive financial implications. However, the narrative that Apple is hopelessly behind in AI ignores their historical playbook. Apple rarely enters a market first. They did not invent the MP3 player, the smartphone, or the smartwatch. They wait until the technology matures, find a way to package it into a highly polished, consumer friendly product, and then dominate the space. Turnus's challenge will be applying that playbook to generative AI. He needs to implement AI in a way that feels invisible and natural to the average user rather than presenting it as a complex standalone tool. CNET recently published an analysis suggesting that Apple's reserved approach might actually be a secret weapon, allowing them to avoid the public missteps and hallucination controversies that have plagued early AI adopters.
Waiting for a market to mature works when you are dealing with consumer gadgets. Artificial intelligence feels fundamentally different. It is an infrastructural shift akin to the invention of the internet itself. If you wait too long, developers build their ecosystems elsewhere, and you lose the foundational layer. We saw this with smart speakers. Apple arrived late with the HomePod, and despite superior audio hardware, it never captured the market share of Amazon's Echo or Google Nest, because the underlying voice assistant Siri remained inferior. If Ternus treats AI as just another feature to be polished rather than a foundational platform shift, Apple risks becoming a premium hardware manufacturer running on other people's intelligence.
That is a valid historical parallel, and the HomePod remains a clear example of Apple's limitations when software agility is prioritized over hardware design. But Turnus has a distinct advantage moving forward: control over the entire stack. Because Apple designs their own silicon, they can dictate the specific architecture needed to run localized AI models efficiently. They are not dependent on third party chip makers. Furthermore, Cook is not disappearing entirely. By transitioning to executive chairman, mirroring the moves of Jeff Bezos at Amazon and Reed Hastings at Netflix, Cook will handle the complex geopolitical and regulatory battles. He will manage the relationships with international policymakers, which frees Turnus to focus entirely on product vision and engineering execution. This division of labor allows the new CEO to immerse himself in the technical challenges of catching up in the AI sector without being bogged down by the relentless demands of global diplomacy.
The geopolitical landscape Cook leaves behind is arguably as complex as the technological one. Over the last decade, Cook navigated trade tensions, tariffs, and a delicate relationship with manufacturing hubs in Asia. He kept the supply chain flowing during a global pandemic, which is an astonishing feat of logistics. By retaining Cook as executive chairman to manage those external pressures, Apple's board is essentially attempting to split the CEO role into two: an outward-facing diplomat and an inward-facing product architect. This setup places immense pressure on Ternus to deliver on the product side. He cannot blame supply chain bottlenecks or regulatory hurdles if the next generation of Apple devices fails to inspire the market.
Ternus will definitely have no place to hide regarding product innovation. He has spent decades working behind the scenes, allowing people like Cook or design chief Joni Ive to take the public spotlight. Now he must become the public face of the company. His recent appearances, such as the New York event in March of 2026, show a leader who is deeply comfortable discussing the granular details of hardware materials and carbon footprint reductions. Apple highlighted that under his leadership, the hardware engineering team developed new materials to make products more resilient while lowering environmental impact. But leading the whole company requires communicating a broader vision. He must articulate why Apple matters in an era where software increasingly dictates the user experience. He has to convince consumers that owning an Apple device offers a tangible benefit that a competitor's AI infused software cannot replicate.
It forces us to reevaluate what we consider successful leadership in technology. Steve Jobs provided the artistic and visionary spark that resurrected a dying company. Tim Cook provided the operational discipline that transformed that spark into the most valuable corporation on the planet. John Ternus must now find a synthesis between the two. He inherits an organization with unlimited resources, but also sky-high expectations and a rapidly shifting technological landscape. The announcement of his appointment on September 1st will mark the beginning of a critical test to see if Apple's culture of meticulous hardware engineering can survive the messy, unpredictable software revolution currently underway.
Ultimately, Ternus must define Apple's future as fiercely as he defends its past. He cannot rely solely on the safety of the iPhone upgrade cycle forever. The transition from Jobs to Cook proved that a company can evolve its identity without losing its market dominance. The transition from Cook to Ternus will reveal whether Apple can adapt to a world where the physical device is secondary to the intelligence operating within it.
Tim Cook's legacy of turning Apple into a $4 trillion powerhouse is secure. But the challenge of keeping it there now falls entirely on a hardware engineer staring down an AI-driven future.
If you found this breakdown of Apple's leadership transition insightful, text this episode to a friend who is always upgrading their devices.